So, the next band I want to discuss is the Beatles. It's
Oh, I
obviously.
have.
Yeah.
I
Alright, so here is our next music roundtable, featuring once again the same lineup of me, Chris Bartgall, the host, and then also Benjamin Bartgall and Matthew. Now, this episode we're going to be discussing the Beatles. Now, we're going to be trying to figure out what the greatest album one the Beatles have is, but we will also be discussing some other things, including sort of the progression of the Beatles' discography from album to album, as well as the lyrical stylings and meanings behind them. Now, I just want to say before we begin, if you like classic rock, I have lots of classic rock album review videos on my channel. Subscribe to the channel, go watch them, comment, whatever. My current video that's out right now is The Clash's Give 'Em Enough Rope. And next Friday I'm going to be releasing a review of The Who's debut album, My Generation. And without further ado, let's get on to the roundtable. So yeah, I guess we'll start with you, Matthew, since you so far I think had the least speaking time. Uh,
hmm
So, I mean, tell us what you think the best Beatles one is, and then we will do then the free album one here a little bit into this, but start just with altogether what you think the best sort of one is and how much you could consider a one.
Ooh, this is the Beatles are my favorite band of all time. They're just what can you say? It's the Beatles. You know, it's the Beatles, the Beatles, the Beatles. Um, I would say their best album run is from Rubber Soul to like Abbey Road. That's like to me. That's like when they hit their like. Of course, they got. I think there was like a lead up to like their full artistic mode was in Revolver. That's like when they start like you hit kind of more serious, but then like with other stuff like Help and also Rubber Soul, which I think is honestly in my top five favorite Beatles albums. I think to me it's kind of underrated. Um, but I would go Rubber Soul to Abbey Road, which I think the latter is the best Beatles album.
Alright, Ben, you want to go?
guess there's two questions to start with, which is, I think the most important one is whether or not we can get a submarine.
You can count it if you want, you can count it if you don't want. I personally was not going to count it.
I don't think I was gonna count.
Yeah, it only has like
Elsewhere.
4 original new songs.
Yeah.
Let's just skip
So,
that. Yeah, I think that what Matthew said is probably the tightest one you can construct. If you want to be a little bit bolder and expand it to include Help and Let It Be, which I might will do. That is also a very strong one. I think that's better than any of the Led Zeppelin ones that we've constructed. Yeah, I think as the broadest possible, like really strong one that you could define, excluding Yellow Submarine is Help through Let It Be, so just all of them.
Yeah.
Including Magical Mystery Tour's LP track listing. With EP, it's a little bit tiny bit more complicated, but that's not a bad EP.
Well, if it's an EP, it really wouldn't be counted under album one anyway, because it's on an album.
That's true. If you're counting... Now, to some extent, Magical Mystery Tour has, like, a cheat in the system that its album has, its singles thrown at the end. Has singles that will, single only exclusive single content thrown on the end of it that increases its quality quite a bit more than the whole Magical Mystery Tour concept, I guess. But some of the strong songs aren't wildly disconnected from the vibe. And Strawberry Fields Forever kind of is related to I Am the Walrus in some way. Not directly, but sonically. in terms of the overall vibe, like Hello Goodbye and All You Need Is Love and stuff, they match, magical mystery tours vibe in a I think difficult to dispute way. I mean, yeah, I think I'm inclined to say, but I think I'm gonna go with Help through Let It Be.
Okay. I want to say right off the bat, I'm going to agree with Ben here. Help Through Let It Be. I think Help and Let It Be are both Beatle albums in the White Album. And I am somebody who's kind of a fan of the sort of genre roulette style of the White Album, more than some people, honestly. There's some people who love to kind of complain about the White Album. I'm not really one of them. But it is one of the weaker ones we're looking at here, since we're not talking really about the first four. I think the Beatles' weakest album, personally, for me, at least going by the UK track listings, is With the Beatles, although Beatles For Sale is also a little bit weak, although I do think it's a little bit stronger. But Help, I think, is a really great album. Dizzy Miss Lizzie's placement on the album, and especially at the end of the album, is unfortunate. But it's not really enough, I don't think, to bring it down, because it is an absolute banger album otherwise. Like, all of its songs have this kind of, it's not all that different of a feel from what you get on Revolver Soul. It is kind of a light folksy thing. Honestly, a lot of the songs on there are more folksy than, like, Drive My Car. So you have this kind of light folksy feel on it that honestly kind of started on the last album as well, but you got this kind of light folksy kind of pop rock feel on it. And it's pretty consistent with the exception of maybe Dizzy Miss Lizzie. And you got some kind of more, what kind of leans onto kind of the countryside with, I've Just Seen a Face and Act Naturally. I think it's a great album, so I definitely want to include it. And Let It Be, there's some people who don't like Let It Be, and I'll agree, For You Blue isn't like the best song or anything, but Let It Be is generally like a banger album. I think it does a lot of what the White Album did in terms of kind of being a bit more stripped down, a bit more woodsy in places, kind of a bit more simple, but it also is more harmonious in the White Album, with Lennon and McCartney working a bit better together there than they do on the White Album. And so I feel like it's honestly like sort of like the Beatle version of the White Album sound. Abbey Road is kind of this big finale that was recorded afterwards, that came out, it was recorded before, Abbey Road. Abbey Road was recorded after Let It Be, but came out before. But it's kind of a different sound again. But I'd say kind of White Album and Let It Be are kind of in the same style. But I would say I think of that style a bit more stripped back, a bit tighter in between Lennon and McCartney, a bit less so than between them and Harrison. I think it works better for that sort of thing. You've got the woodsy songs like Two of Us, that's honestly better in my opinion than something like I Will, or Blackboard, or Mother Nature's Son. Although I like all those songs too. It's just, it's a bit like title, you got some really great other things like I've Got a Feeling and Dig a Pony. I feel like it just, and it's Beatle paced, it's a single LP, and it's a bit more consistent. You don't have this kind of genre roulette thing that I was talking about, although I do kind of enjoy listening to White Album, kind of actually not in spite of, but because of that. So I feel like Let It Be really does deserve to be included. I know a lot of people didn't, like it that much when it first came out, and I've never really understood that. I do think it is a great album. Matthew, you want to go?
Oh, sure. I didn't basically win. I didn't include Help or Let It Be. I was because I didn't like those albums. I really do like those albums, and I think especially Let It Be, although it's a weird final album for the Beatles, it's still a pretty good album. Like, it wasn't better than Abbey Road, but it's still a pretty good album, and also Help is also good too. That's like it's kind of a weird when early Beatles, like where it's kind of like their quote unquote boy band era, it's like their best kind of,
It came out. It came out. Hold on, I'll give you a minute. It came out the same year as Revolver Soul,
Yeah.
I'd say it is leaning towards Rubber Soul, and also I want to say with as in response to what you said on Let It Be, I agree it's not better than Abbey Road. It works better when analyzed before Abbey Road. The circumstances surrounding its release, with the Beatles breakup and everything, was unfortunate because if you view it as the follow-up to the White Album, and the one before Abbey Road, you look at it, it takes what the White Album does, it makes it tighter, makes it more holistically better, it's just a better album than the White Album. And then, after that, even after that, the band on Let It Be got a bit tighter, a bit more together, and you can see this in the documentary too. They got more together, and they were getting better again, in terms of, working together well, after White Album, and they kind of overcome their differences, and then they make it, and it's kind of the getting better phase, and then they make Abbey Road, and it's the, full-fledged, it's not going to be this way forever, but, let's go out on the absolute high note. So, yeah, Abbey Road, I agree with you, that's the finale. Let It Be is best viewed through the lens of, getting sort of going kind of uphill and getting more harmonious again after the White Album. And, Ben, I think you had something you wanted to say, so go on ahead next.
Yeah, and I will still say it, but would we first say that maybe Let It Be, the album, is about getting back?
Yeah.
Possibly?
Yeah.
Getting back together after being all kind of a mess on the White Album?
Yeah, I mean, okay, anyway. It is actually, to some extent, my understanding that the recording of Abbey Road was smoother than if Let It Be.
Well, yeah, it was, they were, and you can see this in the documentary. The White Album, it was kind of a mess, and they were all kind of doing their own thing, but they kind of start getting their shit back together while doing Let It Be, and so they're able to make something that's kind of like a better kind of title version of the White Album that's a single LP. But then at the end of that, they're sort of back and more harmonious together again, and they're kind of back in their prime, especially Paul and John, somewhat less so for George, obviously. And then they'll say, okay, we're going to make a last one, and then we're going to break up, but we're going to be, we know we're doing this, so we're going to make it the best we've done, and we're going to all walk towards, doing the best. And they did. They put out this great album, and they made it a perfect finale. And so, it's a lot different sound than what's on Let It Be. Let It Be is musically a lot closer to me, for me, to the White Album than it is to Abbey Road. With Abbey Road, it's more like, let's kind of cap off everything we've done, so far. You have Oh Darling, which is kind of in the same sort of style as, the White Album and Let It Be, but then you also have stuff like Maxwell, which is kind of similar to When I'm 64, and so on. Come Together is kind of a bit more of a kind of classic sort of sounding thing. It's maybe a bit reminiscent of a little bit earlier sound, and then you have some more stuff that's a bit more kind of psychedelic-y with, Come Together's lyrics, obviously, but also just kind of with Octopus's Garden and stuff. It's a bit similar to, Sargent Pepper's opening, and With a Little Help from My Friends.
Anyway, what was I going to go back to saying? Okay, we're going back to when Matthew was calling Help a boy band album. Okay, so, I used to agree with that. I was like, the sound of Help is not as matured as it is on Global Soul. Even though, to be fair, Global Soul sounds as less mature than it is on Revolver.
Yeah, the real problem is Dizzy Mercilessly at the end makes it sound like it's something that was on, with the Beatles. Not even, A Whole Day's Night, but, with the Beatles, or even Please Me. Whereas, it's kind of misleading. If you listen to up until that point and you stop it on Yesterday, it is a lot deeper album than... Really, the last song feels just completely out of place. It should have been probably on Beatles For Sale, because it makes it... It sounds like an older style. It feels almost like it's reverting, whereas the rest of Help feels like it's moving towards Rubber Soul.
Yeah, Help... In some ways, Help isn't a break, but in some ways it is. And I think it's a more obvious place to put the break than Revolver Soul, even if some things like Disney watch to put it. But it's not a whole break. And in some ways continues the themes of the first two songs on Beatles For Sale.
Yeah,
and
I'm a
Beatles For Sale
loser.
has this excellent name. It has an excellent name.
I'm a Loser is kind of, honestly, it's a song that could have been on Wobble Soul, but it was on Beatles For Sale, and then you have kind of help in between that. You know, you see that style of a kind of more folk rock starting out there with, like, I'm a Loser, and also, to some extent, No Reply, and then it continues on in Help, throughout Help, and then kind of reaches its climax in, there's a spiral crawling on my wall over there. It reaches its climax on Wobble Soul, and then it kind of then shifts into this more psychedelic thing than in Revolver, which then continues on throughout Sgt. Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour, before kind of reverting to a more kind of country folksy thing again on the White Album and Let It Be.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a legitimate point, though. There's a story, that Paul McCartney tells about his aunt. I mean, so, to some extent, this might be a breaking case, and this is around the time of Revolver. So, like, the first breaking point, I'm gonna say that this is not the breaking point, but I would say that the trends at this point reveals back into the past as well as forward help illuminate this for me. So there's a story that Paul McCartney tells about his aunt. This is, why do you always write songs about love all the time? Can't you ever write about horse or the Summit Conference or something interesting? And he was like, I guess I'm writing a song about something random, like, Bingo started reading a book, and the concept of books, stuff, that turned into paperback title. But, I will say, so, to some extent, that, in some ways, conceptualizes a breaking point. From before that, almost all the songs, other than covers, I guess, tend to be about some sort of romance in some ways. And then after that, there's still love songs, but there's also a bunch of other stuff. Like songs about the tax man, and songs about Yellow Submarine, all kinds of stuff. And I think that in some ways that does make a tempting breaking point between a band that is almost entirely focused on love songs and a band that is not. But I think you have to some extent, look at the types of thoughts in some of these love songs. I think you'll see a shift.
I'm a Loser was the shift. It's a lot more complex, kind of thematically. Even though it is about kind of romance that's going along, it's a lot more complex thematically than even some of the other Love Lost songs like Yesterday, although Yesterday came out after it, or stuff before that, like, I don't know, something from Hard Day's Night.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna agree. The shift is towards more poetic self-examination.
It's a bit more inward in some ways.
I like No Reply too, though it's a little bit more straightforward. I'm a Loser is kind of a thing where instead of just being like, I'm happy I'm in love or I'm sad that I'm not, and there's still songs that Beatles For Sale like that. It's like, this is my fault. Like, the Beatles' appeal originally was in many ways to, like, young teenage or college-age girls. That they appealed to them, as well as, I mean, some of it covers, like, Tristan Shouted, or more broad towards the youth, but that appealed to them, not in the sense, not to, like, the man's sense of machismo, like Elvis sometimes did, though they did try that, but to the, like, feminine old, well, not the feminine urge, though, not to essentialize this, of the constructed gender wall idea of romance as it was understood to be in the countercultural space. It's not the 60s countercultural, but the 50s countercultural space. well, you have men that are rebels without a cause, that are basically somebody's elements of Latin machismo, but then reifying them into a more American or British style, adopting elements of African American culture, more openness about sexuality and stuff that was more tolerated there than in white society. But you have this kind of countercultural space among the white youth in America, and then also in Liverpool because of its strong American influences, of a masculine figure. And like clearly, well, what John Lennon would call the rocker figure. And clearly Lennon and stuff did indulge in that, especially in the Quarry Men at times. But in many ways, what they ended up presenting themselves as, and the Beatles initially, was like a teen idol, or like somebody whose attractiveness to women is non-threatening in many ways, even in the sad songs. Although some questionable stuff, like in "you can't do that" and stuff, but in a image of not a weird edginess, but the edge still existing for the counterculture, but in a way that appeals to not just women that will participate in that countercultural space of rock, but more Broadway, which is why the Beatles broke through so hard. That kind of straddle between, this guy could be your husband, if you could live this 1950s white ideal of like your handsome, talented husband John Lennon and whatever, but then also this kind of edgy. I mean, I'm not gonna say that these songs are sexual, because most of them are not. Even compared to 1950s songs. But there's a little bit more edge, I guess, than you would get from a non-rock single. And there's more excitement. There's a little bit more rebelliousness in it. Especially when they're doing. It's some of that is the world culturally that they'll covers the 50 songs they're doing. You kind of have this attempt at a synthesis of 50s culture and the 50s countercultural segment of rock and roll culture, rocker culture. I'm not gonna say it didn't work, because it did, but it wasn't like a sustainable synthesis of those things, because for both representations of more complicated forces. And the Beatles themselves, as they grew older and whatever, moved towards a more introspective initially, or more complicated, and in many ways more edgy, form. And I'm a Loser, I wouldn't say it's an edgy song, but it is a self-deprecating song. And like previous songs like that, like "I'll Cry Instead" or whatever, or they're like, John Lennon's like, "I'm sad." It's stuff which takes away the edge and like humanizes him in a way that is palatable to their mostly female audience. They're like, look, this man is instead of like going and acting out like the 50s countercultural idea, or stoically holding it in is the 50s cultural idea, he's going to be honest about his feelings in a way. But that honesty is still, he is kind of still a saintly, I guess, figure. Which John Lennon in real life is not a saintly figure, but he sometimes portrayed himself as such. He's still an idolized figure in that. And I'm a Loser, he's not. He's like, I'm not sure what I did, but like, I know it was me. And I'm a Loser, I screwed up. And you had that repeating in stronger form in Revolver Soul. with No Will Man, but he begins to he's talking about somebody with fjord person, but he's in some ways expressing an identity loss from this idolized figure that, well, she's not describing that identity loss from the idolized figure directly. He's not like, I was this member of the Fab Four, and I don't feel like I am that anymore. But in some ways he is saying that. There were many different things that Noble Man says, and we're not going to get full discussion of that here today.
Yeah, well, this whole thing about I was a member of the Fab Four, but I really wasn't so good under the sort of veneer is something we see going on and on, ultimately culminating to some degree with a sort of interview he gave shortly after the release of Plastic Ono Band, as well as, I guess, God, the song. But you could already see it's kind of starting to crack in places, even in, like, 1969 and even in 1968 and such.
Oh, well, I mean, I think it was cracking in 64. I mean...
Well, it was cracking in 64.
But, like, in Help, you also see Paul move in a direction similar to that, though never as... I mean, it's kind of weird to call John Lennon self-loathing, but he kind of goes through a self-loathing process.
Paul's music never got quite to the same level of, kind of dark and dreary. I'm not saying that was a bad thing. Yeah, I'm not saying that John's music that I'm describing as dark and dreary is bad music. Paul always knew when to keep things kind of upbeat.
But in Yesterday, Paul, in some ways, he doesn't go through the same process of humanization that John does. And not the humanization of an idol, like in I'll Cry Instead or something like that, but a humanization of John Lennon, the human that actually existed. And Paul McCartney, the human that still exists, Paul McCartney. I mean, Paul goes through a humanization of himself in Yesterday, I would say. And then we're going to go back to John Lennon again, because I have more thoughts about that now. But Paul goes through a humanization of himself with Yesterday is not a self-loathing song at all in some ways. But in some ways it kind of is. Like, I'm a loser. I said something wrong, now I long for yesterday. It's acknowledging a flaw in its author in a way that seems sincere, that had previously not been there. In the art. And back to John. In Help, once again, you have an escalation of themes about de-idolization. When I was younger, so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help in any way. But now these days, I'm not self-assured. I find I've changed my mind. I've opened up the door. Help me if you can. I'm feeling down.
And I do appreciate you being around. Help
me get my feet back on the ground.
Won't you please help me?
It's my understanding from Lennon's interviews, the more coherent ones, that in some ways that is a very sincere, one of his more sincere songs, along with No Will Man and No Reply, about how he was doing at that time. But he's, in some ways, is a real calling out for help, as opposed to something like I'll Cry Instead, which is a adding of a human vulnerability to an idol to make that idol more attractive to women. Here, he's just like, help me. And yeah, it sounds kind of romantic. I do appreciate you being around to help me. But in many ways, it's not. It's not a romantic song. There's a romantic element of it. He's not nihilistic. He's not alienated from everyone. But he's concerned about that happening. But in some ways, when he was younger, he was alienated from everyone. As the idol, even if he was happier and didn't need help, he was in many ways as self-assured. That's the problem in it. And in You've Got to Hide Your Love Away also, he is talking about a real thing from telling him that when he got married that he was not to be talking about that. And I mean, we're not going to get into John Lennon's relationship or what he thought or felt about that. But I do think that there was a real impulse in that song, that there was I think the most explicit discussion of it in Help or in any albums prior to like the Y album or Sgt. Pepper's or whatnot. The most explicit discussion of the relationship of the ideal of John Lennon, a single accessible man to people that he would not have gotten involved with, like teenage girls or whatever. To be this image, to be this character that was just, when he had something that he thought was good and sincere, and whether it was or not, it's kind of hard to tell, but I do think the song suggests that at least there was some level of sincerity to it, that he did seem to feel quite a bit discomfort with the idea that he had to hide his marriage, no matter how crappy the marriage it was, that he felt like he was having to lie about himself in a way that not only was he having to cover up his flaws, he was having to hide his love away. That he was having to strip away good things about himself and not just hide the bad. And like, in some ways, John Lennon spends a lot of his discography as a solo artist just kind of screaming in pain about this issue, and in some ways that is the defining theoretical thematic concept in John Lennon's music up until Double Fantasy, what finally resolves itself.
Kind of a fitting finale, honestly, for the guy's career, kind of ending on that sort of happier, hopeful, more sort of hopeful, kind of happier, more domesticated sort of note.
Yeah, it's still not perfect there, but like it's a lot better. It's a lot more honest,
but it's getting better all the time.
Yeah, it's a lot more. It's an honest form of happiness, because a lot of John Lennon's honest songs, even Gig Battle, which is a somewhat optimistic songs, the ones that are most personally honest, the most personal of his songs, some of them are writhing. And I know we're getting off topic here, but this is my argument for why Help should be included. And you could feel this writhing starting, and, well, technically in Beatles For Sale, but really starting on Help, and you also see a movement towards Paul beginning to move towards a more authentic, more artistically personal, more. And Paul's more of a showman than Lennon. The Lennon was always still a showman. He still contained the aesthetic. His advocacy for peace, while I think sincere, still nevertheless had to be a performance to convince people to do such thing. Singles are always going to be performers. The question of authenticity is always going to be questionable at best. But in terms of like artistic significance and like the types of issues being addressed, Help, I think, is the first album where there's repeated addresses of significant poetic concern, significant personal concern that previously did not exist. So that's the argument for why Help needs to be in this.
Well, the way I see it, Ben and Matthew, is you've got the early Beatles period. It is a little shallow, but you got the great choruses, you got the great hooks, you got the great playing. That's Please Place Me, that's with the Beatles, that is A Hard Day's Night, which is sort of the great, shining star on a hill of that sort of style. And then you got, also Beatles For Sale, where you do kind of start seeing a bit of a change at Beatles For Sale, but it's still mostly that. Starting with Help, you get kind of this mid-period that is a bit of a sort of it's a bit of a mixture between the styles. You still have things that are like A Ticket to Ride that's like before, you know? You still got some of that great kind of more simpler kind of stuff, but then you also got the stuff like Help and whatever that is very much, you know, getting more personal, and you have it from Paul too. You see it then a lot on like Revolver Soul, and you know, you see it some on Revolver as well, probably not as much as on Revolver Soul, but you know, the thing is, and then that continues, you know, you see it even in the song like Getting Better on Sgt. Pepper's and whatever, but the way I see it, you've got kind of this mid period that's sort of Help in Revolver Soul, and maybe to also a lesser degree Revolver, which is kind of, you get kind of the best of both worlds of the, you get, you know, the best of what's great about the early Beatles distilled, you get the kind of the knack for, you know, these kind of simpler songs that are very catchy, but then you also get some of the more serious John Lennon, more serious Paul. You start to see more and more of George's songwriting skills on Help. I mean, Help is honestly, it has like I Need You, and that's kind of where you start seeing George get really more and more of a thing in terms of songwriting ability. You start seeing him being more of a kind of a creative force in the band, whereas he wasn't really. I'm trying to remember if he even did anything on Beatles For Sale. I know he sang a cover, but I don't remember if it was any of his songs on that particular LP. But so you have him there, you know, and you start to see more of this sort of more personal stuff, but you also see more of a kind of more of the sort of what I call the vinyl, sort of the poppy or sort of more, you know, accessible stuff. It's kind of a hybrid sort of format there, but you kind of get the best of both worlds, as I was saying there. And then Wobble Soul starts going in a more personal direction, but then with, I guess, doing drugs, you sort of see it move a little bit less or so again on Revolver to some degree, but it kind of flickles back and forth. It's less personal, I'd say, than Wobble Soul, but it's not exactly not personal. And as been said, Paul also starts discussing more personal topics, like You Won't See Me on Wobble Soul, for instance, is about a relationship he was having, I believe. It's not exactly really, it's maybe a little bit too, you know, indignant about, you know, whether or not he did something wrong or not, but, that's something else I just kind of want to point out, is that Paul continues to have these kind of more personal songs on, you know, Wobble Soul. Revolver, arguably, you could, I think, say, Gotta Get You Into My Life is a personal song about him learning to love weed. It's, you know, it's a little weird to, I guess, say it like that, but you could say it is about something that he seems to consider a personal, important event in his life, and it's kind of this veneer of lovey-dovey stuff, but it is, I believe, actually about marijuana, so that's another song that I think we could arguably apply this to. And I want to hear your thoughts, Matthew, because Ben's been talking for a long time, and now I've been talking, so I kind of want to get you back in the conversation here and hear what your thoughts on Help to some degree, as well as the progression artistically of the Beatles.
Yeah, it's basically like the precursor. It's like they're easing themselves into, like, you know, basically they're more thoughtful and more critically acclaimed work that they would later do. And I would say I would change my mind and I would include Help in the their best run.
Would you say that you changed your mind and opened up the door to letting Help be in your album one?
Yeah, I think so. And I would probably also say Let It Be. I put that in there as well.
Let It Be, you just have to kind of see in the right context, because it feels weird if you listen to Abbey Road and it's like this kind of thunderous, epic finale, especially the last song on Let It Be. And not Let It Be, Abbey Road is this big like finale and the last song of the long one and all that. And then you go to Let It Be and it feels... But if you view it at the right spot as sort of more of the kind of culmination of a white album, as well as kind of setting the scene for Let It for Abbey Road, letting the Beatles be more sort of together again and kind of getting a bit better and less individualistic as they were on the White Album. I think it works better if you view Let It Be as kind of the bridge between the two of them. It kind of fulfills the promise of White Album, but it also sets the stage for sort of the epic finale. It's like if this was a movie, this would be the like suit up montage of, right before the final battle.
Yeah.
So now, excuse me, Matthew's
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good.
Now I think we need to discuss what the best free album one is of the Beatles. Because obviously we've already said we think the best one is, and this is probably the best one of all time. I mean, let's be honest, here, guys. Help through Let It Be. But what's the best free consecutive albums? I think I already know what I'm going with. But I do want to, I guess, start with you, Matthew. What do you think?
So we're not including Yellow Submarine and Magic Mystery Tour.
We are including Magical Mystery Tour. We are not including Yellow Submarine. I mean, if you wanna try to cut out Magical Mystery Tour, if that helps you, you can do that. But I am personally including in my consideration Magical Mystery Tour, and you could discuss also the pros and cons of different free album ones. It's like maybe you considering between like one or another or whatever.
I've got 2 album runs that I'm considering.
Okay, well, let us know what both those are then.
One is Rubber Soul, Revolver, and then Sargent Pepper, and then the other is Sargent Pepper, the White Album, and Abbey Road. Those are the 2 I'm weighing between.
The way I see it, another one you could do, although I don't think you're going to do this, obviously, but another one I'm just going to throw this out here. I'm not personally picking this one, but I'm going to throw this out here as something to think about, is I personally consider kind of Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and the LP version of Magical Mystery Tour as sort of a psychedelic trilogy, and then I guess you could kind of, if you want to add just kind of like a little store on top of a tree, that's kind of like Yellow Submarine EP.
Yeah.
For what you said, I mean, Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, Abbey Road, they're all kind of big albums. I mean, they all feel like they have this, like, huge scope to them. They're very, like, heavy hitters. As I said, the White Album's a long album. It has a lot going on. It, in a lot of places, has a lot of very individualistic sort of songs on it. A lot of stuff that's more kind of just shows off one aspect of one member of the band's personality and like not anything else. Whereas, Abbey Road, as I said, although was kind of a big epic culmination, and then Sgt. Pepper's is kind of more similar, I think, to Abbey Road than it is to the White Album. It's the more psychedelic than Abbey Road is, but it's more together. The band is more together on it than they are later on. There's a lot of Paul on that album, but it does feel like he's more together with John, whereas it feels like him and John aren't really working together that much at all on the White Album, They're both doing some good things. There's maybe a song here or there, but, it feels they feel a bit too separate on that album. As for what you said about Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper's, that's a good pick, too. I mean, I think both of these are good picks. You have on Rubber Soul, I mean, I've already talked at length about Rubber Soul. Revolver is, one of my personal 2 favorite Beatles albums, along with Abbey Road, probably my favorite. And you've still got, kind of similar to what I said about Help, you still got some little bit of in-between stuff on there, because you do stuff like Good Day Sunshine, but it's a bit more musically advanced than what they did earlier, but it is kind of a similar kind of vibe. And then you also start seeing the psychedelic stuff that then leads into Sgt. Pepper, which also kind of has some of the similar sensibilities. Like, a lot of Paul's songs are kind of, you got, Lovely Rita, you got, whatever. And it's also kind of that very kind of show, you've got a lot more showmanship. It feels like just listening to them, despite the fact that they weren't doing live performances at that point. This whole concept of Sgt. Pepper's being a band has showmanship to it, but then also, like, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, feels kind of like John Lennon's like a wing leader, or like somebody who's like a hype man outside the door, who's like, hyping up something, and, some other songs have kind of vibes like that. Getting Better, honestly, is a pretty optimistic song. So, they're good albums. It does represent kind of what feels like a very... I mean, both of those you listed feel like they cover a much broader gap than they really do. I mean, neither one of those are really that far apart in terms of years. I mean, those are both, 3 years each. But they feel not... like they don't exactly lock together as holistically, because you see a lot of stuff change in them, Revolver Soul, you go, and Revolver kind of similar, and Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's are kind of similar. Sgt. Pepper and Revolver Soul aren't as similar, but I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad thing or to the detriment of the one you're talking about. With Sgt. Pepper and the White Album than Abbey Road, as I said, the White Album feels more separate than Sgt. Pepper Abbey Road feel from each other, in my opinion. Just because the band feels more harmonious on those, whereas the White Album feels more of a kind of very... from song to song, it shows like it's the Beatles, but it's the Beatles more as people. You get Paul, it's like, here's Paul, here's what he likes. He likes forms, he likes nature, he likes, kind of ballads. It's like, here's John. John, he likes some of this kind of dark or a little bit horror, a little bit more sinister sounding stuff, but it's also a lot more personal, and has his problems, he can't get to sleep, or whatever, but, there's still kind of lighter bits in his stuff, like Dear Prudence, and also he has, mommy issues, and etc. And then George is singing whatever the hell George is singing. While My Guitar Gently Weeps is the best song of the album. It's an absolute banger. It's one of the best Beatles songs altogether. But then, you also got kind of Savoy Truffle and Long, 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 and it's kind of all over the place. I guess Long, Long, Long kind of represents the more spiritual side of George, but then Savoy Truffle represents the more kind of, I guess, his friendship with Eric Clapton, and then While My Guitar Gently Weeps is also kind of the more spiritual side of him. Well, I guess Savoy Truffle is the more lighter side, and then Piggies is the more, I guess, spiritual but more explicitly political side of him. And of course you have Ringo, who is kind of this kind of guy who, he's the drummer, he's in a rock and roll band, but he also kind of does some of this country vibe stuff, and that's Don't Pass Me By, obviously. And he also has wholesome vibes with Good Night. So, I think both of those are solid. I don't really have any advice to give you if you're trying to pick between those, though, Matthew. So, if there's anything more you want to say it, and then we'll ask Ben what his thoughts are on Free Album 1.
I think I'm going to go with the latter. I'm going to go with Sgt. Pepper, then the White Album, and then Abbey Road.
Yeah, well, those are all very, very big, sort of very imposing landmark albums, so I think I kind of understand your reasoning there. Ben, what are your thoughts on the Beatles' best Free Album 1?
That is a difficult question because of the fact that the White Album is what it is. The White Album is one of my favorite Beatles albums because it has so many good songs on it, and I kind of like the variation in it. And there's also, I think, in many songs, kind of a continuity as well of sound. There's some exceptions. In many cases, it does maintain kind of a continuous, I don't know what else to call it. It's like the White Album sound. Even as it changed topics, like the first 3 songs, I think, maintain that, and then in other places also maintains that. But it's just too long, which it's not to say I hate double albums. I think, for instance, just from another Beatles person, All Things Must Pass's first 2 records as a whole work quite well.
What's more homogenous, because you don't have the clashing personalities exactly going on there.
homogeneity is not necessarily good in an album, and I think in some ways the White Album benefits from its eclecticness.
The White Album, yeah, does. As I said, I'm a fan of the kind of John Well Boulez sort of vibe to it. It always makes it kind of a pleasing and oftentimes somewhat surprising listen, which I think gives a kind of weird listenability that even a lot of double albums don't have. I'm usually a fan more of the single LP albums, but White Album has, I think, a weird listenability that even a lot of, especially non-story based, non-rock opera double albums don't have.
Yeah, I mean, when I first listened to the White Album, it blew my mind. And in many ways was what sold me on the Beatles as a band, as the best band. On the other hand, the problem with it is that in some ways it would still benefit from being a single album. Which does not say that would involve cutting songs that I think are good. But
the problem with the people who talk about making the White Album a single album is, to me, is if the White Album wasn't such a hot mess, is it even really the White Album? The White Album thrives on being kind of this random, eclectic mix of stuff. You know, you could cut Revolution 9, but, you know, even if you leave everything else, you know, you have more than 3 sides worth of music there. Now, granted, it's not that much more. You could theoretically cut Revolution 1 as well, since it already has its more superior version than just Revolution. But you still have a lot of stuff that just doesn't have a home elsewhere. It doesn't have a home on Let It Be. It doesn't have a home on anything like Magical Mystery Tour. It's so much completely different in vibe. You gotta have it, you know, somewhere. And where else do you put it except... You know, it honestly feels almost like an outtakes sort of album in some ways, but... Like, if outtakes albums that are like compilations of outtakes had actually been seen the songs actually finished and polished up to their best possible form. Ben?
Yeah, what was I gonna say? I mean, I both agree, but I also, to some extent, do think a single LP version drive album would probably still be eclectic. I mean, ideally, maybe, if it's like a... I mean, it's really only a few songs that really cause the... But just kind of drag towards the end. In some ways, it is like only a few songs that are like the issue on it.
Are we talking about Revolution 9, and what else are we talking about?
Wild Honey Pie, which is brief, but
Wild Honey Pie doesn't really take up much of a runtime on the LP.
Yeah, no, but yeah, I mean, it's just that, and it's Revolution 9. But then there's just like quite a few songs that are like 6s that are like, they're not bad, but they're like this good than what you would get on like Revolver or whatever, and you just kind of have, you just have a lot of it. It's just a lot. I don't know what to say. And unlike other albums that have similar lengths, it doesn't feel like it moves very quickly. Which is not necessarily a bad thing in places. But the issue with the White Album is I'm both a fan of it. I think it's, in many ways, a testament to the Beatles' genius. I think it's a great testament to the Beatles' genius. For like the first, 45, 50 minutes of listening to it.
I wouldn't say it's exactly a testament necessarily to the genius of the Beatles. You could say it's a testament to the genius of Paul McCartney. You could say it's a testament to the genius of John Lennon. You could say it's a testament to the genius of George Harrison. Some of the songs you could say is a testament of genius of the Beatles. And maybe you could say that it's a testament to the genius of Ringo Starr because he's the most kind of consistently their thing, although even he isn't everywhere on that album. But it isn't exactly a testament to the songwriting partnership of Lennon and McCartney or them working together with George's guitar or anything like that exactly.
Yeah, I mean... or at least a testament to those individuals is genius. And I think George Harrison in particular, in some ways.
It's the Beatles as a more decentralized group.
Yeah, I mean, I think the album is a good argument point for the Beatles as a significant artistic project. It's not the only one. In some ways, I do think it's a better argument for it than Sgt. Pepper's is.
Yeah, it feels more like
Sgt. Pepper's is a better album, though, as like an album. If you look at like every single part of it, even maybe if
Sgt.
I'd like,
Pepper's feels like a Beatles album. Whereas the White Album feels almost like a collaboration album between Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and then they all have this guy named Ringo Starr who's like a friend of theirs who's in all their bands, and they give him a song or something too.
yeah, I mean, what was I gonna say? I mean, what was I gonna say? I think in some ways it is a great testament to the significant artistic power of the band, or of the individuals. Let's not fight about that anymore. But I also think it's just it's an issue in some ways. It's kind of brought down, just like Rebel Soul is damaged by having Blood for Your Life on it. White Album is damaged by just how long it is, number one. And to like conceive of it is just kind of difficult. And I don't even hate Revolution 9 now that I think about it. I mean, I think in some ways I like Revolution 9 better.
All I have to say is Revolution 9 is far and away more interesting, musically speaking, than Two Virgins of My Life with the Lions.
Yeah, that's not even something we need to think about. The old parts of Revolution 9, it's kind of oddly, it's like cut up almost of sounds, or like sound collages, techniques, all in some ways useful and stuff, and at times where it walks fine. Like, there are sometimes where it gets the crescendo and stuff, and I wish John had spent more time focusing on kind of making it more cohesive, because they're all later developments, especially in hip-hop and stuff. Which, I mean, I'm not a major hip-hop listener, but they're all instances of songs by, like... And, well, you can see this in other genres, too, with the way samples and stuff were used, but, like, particularly aggressive uses of sampling. Not... Well, let's not get into... In my opinion, it was, like, kind of two forms of, like, sampling that works well. And one of them is the cut-up technique. Well, sometimes some artists will just use like a little snippet of some song where it's almost unrecognizable, but in some of the better pieces I've seen of that, there were some songs, like by Public Enemy and stuff, that have like up to 21 samples making up the flow of it, but it sounds very cohesive. And that is kind of the idea underlying Revolution 9, except for it just hasn't developed very well yet. But at times it comes close. Like, at times it will be like, here's this crescendo of noise, of cars honking and stuff. Well, I mean, Public Enemy sampling other songs and like stuff from like James Brown and stuff, but sometimes you'll have these cars honking and stuff, and it'll be like, you're close here. Now,
it's kind of wall of sound taken to an extreme.
Yeah, sometimes it works close, and I know the Beatles decided this inspiration for Public Enemy as well as more of a gay, and I think to some extent in What's Going On, his snippets of like city sound life were not collaged, or in some ways solve the same function that the best parts of Revolution 9 could solve, but it doesn't cohere. Like, John described it as what the sounds of a revolution would sound like, but it never coheres into a consistent... And I get it, it's avant-garde. It's trying to take ideas from the weird stuff of, like, the 50s and stuff, in classical music. But it's not cohering enough to be pop pure music in some ways, and it's not fascinating enough to me to be, or consistently interesting enough for me to be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna sit down and listen to all 8 minutes of this.
I mean,
But sometimes it comes annoyingly close. It'll be annoying.
It's Battle Band, and we, you type out the song Hats Off to Roy Harper earlier on. And I feel like it should be mentioned that, Revolution 9 is really a song you want to listen to, as opposed, I guess, to Hats Off of Roy Harper, with the stereo effect on, but you don't want it with headphones, you want it out of speakers. That's a kind of a localized sound, but but with a wider sound stage than you get with headphones.
Yeah, I mean,
so we spent a lot of time here, obviously talking about Revolution 9, and the White Album, and I want to ask Matthew something real quick. You obviously picked the White Album as a part of your free album run, but it feels like me and Ben have said more about the White Album than you, so just maybe give us a little bit of your thoughts on the White Album.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Basically, the White Album is just, I like it because it's a mess. Basically, it's like the weirdest one. Like, usually the Beatles albums are like, 13, 14 tracks maybe, and this is like a 30 song behemoth of an album. And the Beatles are like one of the few artists where if they make an album that's like more than a certain amount, I can trust them to make like a vast majority be good records. And it has some of my favorites, like I Will is probably 1A, 1B, maybe one of my favorite Beatles songs. Of course it has, probably, objectively the best song of the album, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And it has like probably one of the better openings of an album, of a Beatles album, with Back in the USSR. And yeah, it's not even like I like Rubber Soul more than White Album in my top 5, but of this criteria I had to put it here.
It's an absolute base, and I do want to say that While My Guitar Gently Weeps, even with Here Comes the Sun coming later, even with George Soliquio, While My Guitar Gently Weeps is still probably my favorite George Harrison song.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, the thing with my album is its strengths, its interestingness, this weird textual thing that makes it artistically distinctive is also in some ways this weakness. And it's a paradox that's not easy to resolve, but also makes me reluctant to be putting it in the best Beatles 3 album one, because it's just weird, gaping paradox. So, I'm kind of divided between what Matthew was saying. Sgt. Pepper's White Album, Abbey Road. That's obviously a very strong one. And the other one I've been thinking of is Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, and Magical Mystery Tour. And Magical Mystery Tour seems like kind of a weird thing to... Well, Magical Mystery Tour, I don't think we could exclude it. It's kind of questionable to exclude it. Because it is a full album, at least here in the United States, and that's the one that's recognized by the Beatles as its official size. I give them the EP originally.
Well, it's the LP version is the thing they repress. When they repress the other albums, they repress the British track listings, not the American track listings of the earlier ones. Some of those albums, like Revolver, ended up kind of butchered, although some of them ended up kind of getting some kind of more interesting track listings as well. But it's the one where they repress the American version in Yellow Submarine, but as I said, Yellow Submarine has a lot of that kind of instrumental stuff by George Martin, which I wouldn't really consider exactly making it a full Beatles album, since they're really only on one side. But on Magical Mystery Tour, it's two sides of the Beatles. When they repress it like that.
Yeah, I mean, the question with Magical Mystery Tour relative to the White Album is the songs on Magical Mystery Tour, other than the weird flying, in some ways the average song on it is better than on the White Album, just because it doesn't have this weird things on it. But on the other hand, in some ways some of the songs I don't know if I should say insipid, Because in some ways, I mean, it's the Beatles and stuff.
Finn, I'm gonna be honest with you. I actually like flying.
Flying is a fine thing.
It works well. It works well, and it as I said earlier something about the showmanship in Sgt. Pepper's, and I think it works very much in a similar way. It's kind of Willy Wonka-esque. Come up with a mystery tour, the magical mystery tour is here to take you away, take you today, and then you kind of then take off to the magical mystery tour flying it. It's not exactly, I guess, a concept album, but it of the EP, how it is, that's kind of it leads you in after the kind of opening track, and it's very surreal, and it's very kind of trippy and whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The question is like, with, yeah, I mean, I think Magical Mystery Tour is a good album. I think it is. Now, some of that is cheating, which makes me feel reluctant. To say the Revolver Sgt. Pepper's Magical Mystery Tour one, even though I came in wanting to say that. The part of me that is reluctant to do it's like Magical Mystery Tour kind of cheats because it has these singles added onto it, two of which really do date from Sgt. Pepper's. But in some ways, they're all thematically similar-ish. I mean, Strawberry Fields Forever is this really complicated beast, kind of like I'm the Walrus, which is on both versions of it.
I mean, I see it, Magical Mystery Tour is the true sequel to Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sequel to Sgt. Pepper's. It has weirdness. It has lots of weirdness. I mean, even songs that could be argued to be insipid, like All You Need Is Love. Oh, good, because it feels sincere from them. And it makes sense in the context of 67 in a way that, I don't know, Oasis, when they did a thing kind of like that. It just felt weird. And, what are you guys doing? I mean, some of that may also just have to do with your voices, but if an accent, which, I mean, but the tension between Magical Mystery Tour and the White Album in some ways is kind of defining this. I mean, Sgt. Pepper's I think is a slightly overrated album actually, but it's still a 9. But some people act like it's a 10. It's not a 10, it's a 9. But it's an above average 9. As is Magical Mystery Tour. As is Revolver Soul, arguably. If Revolver Soul did not have that last song on the end of it, I'd probably say Revolver Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper's were also a very good pick for this, but... And to some extent that draws back to the thing I was discussing earlier. If Revolver Soul, though, is kind of a relapse into the machismo posturing in a couple songs. It works fine on Norwegian Wood because the morality in it is really questioned. The narrator does not seem awfully reliable in it.
It's a very gray...
You're not being told this is what you should do.
It's a very gray song.
Yeah, and it's being put... I mean, I think the person... The character of John Lennon is playing in Wobbles and no is a bad dude. But
he's also trying to play himself, but I think it's also maybe to some degree an overly exaggerated, overly negative version of himself.
Yeah, and also there's just more interesting musical things, because it's a progressive song, not politically progressive, but progressive in the sense of the techniques being used in it. Or I do think there's the Kinks song, See My Friends. I think that may have came out before that. That was a guitar imitating a sitar. But as a part of it's relation to an Indian fascination wave that swept through Britain that is often just ignored in instead being marked as starting with Revolver For Sale, when it actually did hit before that a little bit, but it wasn't very deep. It was just like a weird fad, but then got reified once again into a maybe still appropriating, but also sincere. But the first wave was kind of just an aesthetic thing that's kind of just probably kind of appropriating. Though I'm not accusing the Kinks, a band I love, of appropriating. They were trying. I mean, but in some ways it was when it first swept through. That then turned into a very sincere cultural appreciation, especially on George Harrison's part, of Indian culture that he maintained through his entire life, and is clearly very, 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 very sincere.
I mean,
and
just
not racist, not inappropriate.
The dude just out and out converted. I mean, that wasn't even really appropriation.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not appropriation at all. I don't think it is a sincere cultural appreciation that develops. And Norwegian Wood itself is in many ways very divorced from that context as a song. But, like, the sitar is not being used in an Indian classical music way either in it. It's being used as a new development thing that leads into the creation of psychedelic rock. That leads into the creation of virtually heavy metal and stuff, even though Norwegian Wood has many folksy, Dylan-esque elements to it that are quite distant from that, too. While One For Your Life is an attempt of a passe of the 50s music. I mean, depending on it's fine, in my opinion, but it's a callback. Yeah, I don't think John Lennon is necessarily endorsing the sentiment in that song either, but it's being portrayed so bluntly. It's being portrayed in this much more blunt style that it becomes unavoidable. Well, with Norwegian Wood, it's like, yeah, this music is like, mitigating, it's emphasizing the author's, the speaker's unreliableness or his moral grayness with his weird combination of Dylan-ness playing by Lennon and then the tour walk that is like creating this weird, not clash though, this weird comparison and counterpoint that is making the thing kind of unsettled in Norwegian Wood.
You're looking for the word contrast, I believe?
Contrast is, yes, but true, but there's just kind of a discord, but also alliance between the two sounds in it. It's not just a contrast. It's a harmony, but also kind of a contrast, yeah, that works in such a way in that the straightforward 50s rock and roll style playing in One For Your Life just does not have. The way the lyrics are being delivered is not, there's kind of a pulsing, kind of a almost weird detachment from what's being described in Norwegian Wood, even though he's describing this really emotionally angry act that he does at the end, but he also seems kind of detached from it. It's like a depressed person doing it. Like, he's angry enough to set somebody's room on fire. On the other hand, he's also detached. He's depressed from it. And it's like a Dylan-esque story, but then the setter and his voice will detach it from it. Well, it sounds like a depressed person that's like kind of screwed up already before the whole thing even starts. Is doing this thing. Wow, there's just an angry machismo in One For Your Life that doesn't have any counterpoint to it. Even if John Lennon's is a story, John Lennon's not necessarily endorsing it. It's delivered not in a narrative style, but like just a direct set of orders about in France. Where there's just really direct rock and roll style playing that is just, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It doesn't provide any counterpoint to anything. It's just like really aggressive.
So what would you say then are your three that you would say?
I'm still not sure, honestly.
Well, you want me to go then ahead of
you? Yeah,
you?
you should go.
I think I've come to a conclusion even before we started this, before I let you all go first, my personal conclusion, and I already gave some of my reasoning for all is, I'm gonna say what my favorite one of three is Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver. As I said, it was kind of the best of both worlds of the kind of older style and the later style, but it's also kind of with Help and Rubber Soul, this was the kind of the Beatles folk rock era. That's a sound I really, really like. But then with Revolver, that's the beginning, but also, in my opinion, the best of the psychedelic era, and as I said, probably my favorite Beatles album, though I really love Abbey Road as well. And so, they're just three albums that are back-to-back. Both Help and Rubber Soul, I will agree, have kind of bad ending songs, whereas Revolver is more consistent all the way through, in terms that both Rubber Soul and Help, the last song, you could arguably cut it off at the end of the next to last song, and it would arguably be better. I'd say musically, One For Your Life is a better song than Dizzy Miss Lizzy, and it fits on the album better than Dizzy Miss Lizzy fits on Help. But obviously, lyrically, it's kind of atrocious in terms of its viewpoint. I mean, I think it's... Even John Lennon, I think, saw that there was something very problematic about the message that that song was saying. I mean, he said as much so before he died, and obviously he didn't come anywhere close to living into what would be considered today's, culture of, what some people call cancel culture or woke or politically correct or whatever. But, I mean, he saw it. And I'd also say, though, both it and Dizzy Miss Lizzy, neither Help or Rubber Soul really have good album closers. If I needed someone, and Yesterday would be better album closers, in my opinion. And you could really just send both thumbs there, but they're still great albums. I mean, we're talking 9, 10 out of 10. Probably 10 out of 10 for both of them. And then Revolver is just even better, If I was able to go over 10 out of 10, it would be over 10 out of 10 as far as an album goes. Because it really is just banger after banger. I mean, even the weakest track on it is Dr. Warburton, and that's still, kind of a banger. I mean, let's be honest here. So, that's what I'm going with. As I said, you get kind of the best of both worlds. You have some of the more introspective stuff. You have the folk rock stuff. You have the psychedelic stuff. But then you have kind of the more standard kind of pop rock stuff, kind of just mix of light bits of folk on Help. You've got stuff like Ticket to Ride on one hand, and on the other hand, you have something like Tomorrow Never Knows. So there's kind of a breadth of sort of style there. I think it's one that is a bit more, you could track progression a bit more homogeneously than with Matthew's picks, and you still haven't picked Joel's spin. But I think what I'm going with is Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver. I think that's the best 3 consecutive albums the Beatles did. Alright, Ben, continue.
Yeah, okay, so
Tell us what you're leaning towards, what you think your options are, because you spent a lot of time talking about the White Album and Rubber Soul both, but you haven't really told us what you were considering being, the starting and ending points of the 3-album one.
I mean, okay, so right now I'm actually deciding between Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, and Magical Mystery Tours of Brock.
Yeah, and what else?
Okay, actually, I'm just going with that, because
Okay.
the way Matthew has to... I was going to say what Matthew was saying, but then I was skipping Magical Mystery Tour, which I just don't think you could do.
You picked...
I think you could also argue Magical Mystery Tour, the White Album, and Abbey Road, which would be slightly different than Matthew's pick. I think...
So go with, the Psychedelic Trilogy. It's probably the most homogenous, 3-album.
It doesn't... I mean, Abbey Road is my favorite album. It's not on that grouping. But, I don't know. The White Album is such a weird, paradoxical thing. Like I said, I love that album. I think it's great. I don't think arguing that the best is bad... I feel kind of uncomfortable putting Magical Mystery Tour in either of them, because it doesn't feel like that's right. But like at the same time, I do think that is right. But like a Magical Mystery Tour White Album Abbey Road one, that just feels weird and like fun. Well, the
You could theoretically do the White
Revolver,
Album
Soldier
Abbey
Peppers.
Ben. You know, you could theoretically do the White Album Abbey Road and Let It Be as well.
That is, yeah, but playing Let It Be. Well, I could do that actually. Yeah, I don't know, but Let It Be has kind of like the White Album, but a lot smaller. Some like issues in my opinion. I like Let It Be. I think it should be a part of the broader line. It's like a good, maybe even like a 9 still.
It's an absolute banger.
I mean, maybe. I think that's also a decent one, but like, I do think that might be a. Yeah. Maybe I do want it to be the White Album. Everybody Let It Be. Yeah, I mean, maybe from an emotional perspective, that is what I want. Emphasis of, I do listen to those albums more than Magical Mystery Tour. Even if Magical Mystery Tour individual songs I like more than some of the songs on that.
I'd still say if you were to pick just the most cohesive one, this isn't one I'm picking. I think mine's probably the second most cohesive one you could theoretically do is the one I like the best. Most cohesive one would be Revolver, Sargent Pepper, and Magical Mystery Tour, because this all sort of have kind of more the psychedelic vibe. You could theoretically throw the EP version and Yellow Submarine on top of that, though obviously you really can't because it came out after the White Album. But in terms of like that era of Beatles stuff, whereas once you have White Album, you know, Abbey Road, Let It Be, I consider that kind of like the late era, like the very late kind of 11th hour Beatles stuff.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess my emotional reaction is what you said in some ways. The White Album, Abbey Road and Let It Be. I feel like emotionally, I feel more attuned to the, or like I on an emotional level that I'm like, what do I possibly listen to more? I think that one is probably accurate. Yeah, that is probably accurate. I just I'm going to answer that as like an emotional response, like it's the one that I listen to the most. One, in terms of like, maybe not objectively, art analysis is never going to be objective, but from like a what albums do I think are better put together, like which are better albums, I guess. The Revolver, Soldier Peppers, and Magical Mystery Tour set, I think, is better. So that's my answer. It's those two. I don't know.
Alright. I think that's
both
fair.
of those options have, I think, quite a bit of strength in them. And I don't know. Like, if I was having to try to argue, like, in an essay, what was, like, the best three album one, or, like, when we get into this, I don't know how much more we're planning on going on. But, like, yeah, I'll probably argue the Revolver, Soldier Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour one, because I think there's a better argument for that. While the other one is like, yeah, I listen to that more, though.
Okay, this is the end of today's video on the Beatles. However, we have a great video coming up next Wednesday that continues the Roundtable, where me and Ben discuss the meaning behind some of the Who's greatest albums, as well as trying to figure out what the greatest album one they had was. So, stay tuned for that. It's coming out next Wednesday. And also, if you missed part 1 of our album Roundtable series that came out last Wednesday, you should be able to go back and find that. I'll have a link to a playlist with all the album Roundtable videos in it below. See you, and I'll thank you for watching.